Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in Life with Father by Clarence Day. This particular story is entitled Father Interferes with the 23rd Psalm. And with that, I'll get started. When we boys were little, we used to go to Mother's room Sunday evenings on our way upstairs to bed and sit in a circle around her while she told us a story from the Bible or talked to us about how good we ought to be and how much we ought to love God. She loved God herself as much as she dared to, and she deeply loved us, and she was especially tender and dear on those Sunday evenings. One of my brothers told me years afterward how much they had meant to him in those days, and how he had cherished the memory of them all his life. I was a little older than my brothers, though, and my feelings were mixed. I loved Mother and hated to disappoint her, but I couldn't respond as easily as the other boys to her gentle appeals. I never seemed to have the emotions that she waited for me to show. I wish now that I could have listened uncritically and have thought only of the look in her eyes. What difference need it have made to me whether we had the same ideas about God, or whether the stories Mother thought lovely seemed less so to me? But there I sat, staring uncomfortably at the carpet and trying to avoid answering questions. One night she repeated the 23rd Psalm to us and asked us to learn it by heart. "The Lord is my shepherd," she whispered softly. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." She raised her eyes and went on bravely, although with a quiver of fear. "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." She had often felt the Lord's rod. I heard Father going by in the hall. He looked in at the doorway and smiled affectionately at us and at Mother. Then he went off, and I heard his firm step as he walked on towards his room. He hadn't meant to interfere with Mother's teachings. He hadn't spoken one word, but I found myself speculating all of a sudden on what his opinion would be of the 23rd Psalm. I couldn't imagine Father being comforted by the Lord's rod and staff, or allowing anybody whatever to lead him to a pasture and get him to lie down somewhere in it. I could see him in my mind's eye, in his tailed coat and top hat, refusing point-blank even to enter a pasture. He would as soon as thought of wearing overalls. In spite of my admiring him for this attitude, it seemed wicked of him. I felt resentful about it. It would have been so much easier for me to be properly reverent if he had not been around. My idea was that if Mother was too religious, Father wasn't religious enough. "Good night, Clarence," I heard Mother saying. "You won't forget, darling." I kissed her and went out, wondering what I was not to forget. Oh yes, she had asked us to learn that psalm by heart. Up in my bedroom, I got out my Bible. It was full of paper bookmarks to help me find texts that I had to memorize, and these bookmarks in turn were full of pictures I had drawn of biblical scenes. A picture of Adam looking doubtfully at the tree of knowledge in Eden, with a complete set of schoolbooks dangling heavily down from its boughs. A picture of Sarah, quote, "dealing hardly with Hagar," end quote, driving her out with a broomstick. A picture of the sun, moon, and stars bowing politely to Joseph. I sat down and added to the collection a picture of Job in pajamas, weeping copiously as he endeavored on top of all his other trials to learn the 23rd Psalm. I also drew his 3 unsatisfactory friends sitting in a row staring at Job. Each friend wore a sardonic expression and had a large mustache, and imperial like Napoleon III. I got out another Bible that Mother had lent me. This one was in French, and it sometimes shocked me deeply to read it. As my belief was that when God had created the world, he had said, "Let there be light," it seemed to me highly irreverent to put French words in his mouth and have him exclaim, "Que la lumière soit." Imagine the Lord talking French. Aside from a few odd words in Hebrew, I took it completely for granted that God had never spoken anything but the most dignified English. The French were notoriously godless, however. It made me laugh, though it frightened me too, to see what liberties they had taken. In my English Bible, David was a fine Anglo-Saxon type, quote, a youth, ruddy, and of a fair countenance, end quote. In French, he was a revolting little snip from the boulevards. Un enfant, blanc, et d'une belle figure. Where my Bible spoke of Leviathan, the French said la crocodile, which ruined the grandeur and mystery of that famous beast. And where mine said, behold now Behemoth, they said, voici l'hippopotame. Instead of the children of Israel fearing lest the Lord should be wroth, the French said, les enfants d'Israël were afraid lest le Seigneur should be irrite. This word irrite appeared everywhere in the French version. It wasn't only the Lord. Cain was très irrite. Moïse, which seemed to me a very jaunty way of referring to Moses, was irrite again and again. Everybody was irrite. When my regular Bible, the real one, impressively described men as wroth, their anger seemed to have something stately and solemn about it. If they were full of mere irritation all the time, they were more like the Day family. I turned at last to the 23rd Psalm. They had spoiled that too. They had twisted it around until it read as though the scene were in Paris. Green pastures were changed to parcs herbeux, and thy rod and thy staff had become ton bâton, as though the Lord were leading David up and down the Bois de Boulogne like a drum major. I decided to go to bed and let that psalm wait for a day or two. But before putting the books back on my shelf, I hunted up the one place in the French Bible that I really liked. Blessed are the meek, my English Bible said, for they shall inherit the earth. I had always hated that verse. It made all religion so difficult. Uriah Heep typified the meek to my mind. The meek were a sniveling, despicable, and uncomfortable lot. But in poring over the French Bible one evening, I had found to my delight that some daring Frenchman had altered this passage, and had changed the Sermon on the Mount into something that a fellow could stand. Heureux les débonnaires. He had presented Jesus as saying, car ils hériteront de la terre. The debonair. That was more like it. I cheerfully jumped into bed. Mother and the Armenian. Mother used to take us boys to a summer resort in our vacations. In all such places there was usually an Armenian prowling around the hotel piazza. Blue-black hair, dark skin, gleaming eyes, a hooked nose, perfect teeth. Mother said that there wasn't a lady on the piazza who didn't envy those teeth. The Armenian was always trying to catch the eye of one of them to see if he couldn't persuade her to look at his rugs or his silks. "Not buy, madame, just look." She would say no, but he would tell her they were oh so beautiful, and offer to give her some perfume, till perhaps, if it were a dull afternoon, she would roll up her knitting and saunter down to the end of the hall where his dark little room was. Since Mother had both a kind heart and a weakness for rugs, she was occasionally snared in this fashion, and shown some bargain, some rug that was intrinsically priceless and could never be duplicated, but which could be had for a few $100s, as it happened, that morning. The crisis that made such a price possible would tomorrow be gone, but today it was here, and a wise and clever woman would seize it. Whoever did would be helping a most grateful young man get through college. He was no dealer. He was just a poor student with a few priceless rugs, and if the lady would only make him an offer, she could buy at her own figure. She could make him an offer, surely, some offer, let it be what it might. It began to seem unreasonable to Mother not to make him some offer, especially as he was trying to get through college, and it might be a bargain. So she silently tried to figure how much she'd have to pay at places like Sloane's, and then she took a lot off, and then she felt a little ashamed at taking so much off. She didn't wish to cheat the young man. He seemed to mean well, poor creature. She worked her price up a little in her mind, and then got a bit frightened because, after all, it was a good deal of money, though it did seem perfectly safe to pay that much, since Lord and Taylor's or Arnold Constable's would have charged more. Still, you never could tell about a rug, because it might not be genuine, and she wished the young man had let her alone and could get through college without her, though he didn't look as though he would manage it. He could hardly speak English, and how could the poor thing talk to the professors, or the professors to him, when even on the subject of rugs, he had to use a sort of sign language which consisted of hunching his shoulders till she feared he would dislocate them, and picking out sums on his fingers in the most confusing manner. However, she had better make him an offer, she felt, and then perhaps he'd stop smiling, which no doubt he intended as pleasant, but his breath was so bad. So she finally said, fingering the rug in a dissatisfied way, that she supposed she could give him 100 for it. The Armenian's smile instantly disappeared. He walked off in gloom. Then he rushed back, excited and jerky, and began a long, rapid expostulation that threatened to deafen us. Mother reluctantly raised her bid to 120 to stop him, whereupon it suddenly appeared that he had misunderstood her first offer. He had supposed it to be 200, not 1. She meant 220. Mother said, no, 120 was all that she had offered. The Armenian then tottered around, sank in a chair, and sort of hissed through his teeth, with such a ghastly look that it made Mother fear that he might be having a fit. It began to seem advisable to her to do anything she could to get out of it, and then never buy anything again for the rest of her life. So she miserably and angrily said she would make it 150. She had to say it several times, however, before he seemed to hear her, and even then he received it only with low shrieks and groans in Armenian. He said that now he would have to give up college because he could not bear such losses. All he had ever hoped of America, he said, was that he wouldn't lose too much money here, but he had found that no one cared how badly he ruined himself, nor did they understand rugs. Poor Mother, half dismayed, half indignant, said she did not want the rug. She only made him an offer because he had asked her to, and she would now like to go. This brought on a frightful collapse, so full of despair it seemed mortal. He was heard, however, to murmur what she took to be a dying request, that she would take the rug with her and split the difference, and leave him alone in his agony. On the way out, she had to tell the hotel clerk to pay him, and have it charged on the bill. At the end of the week, when Father came to visit us and stay over Sunday, Mother had to explain to him that he was now the owner of a rare Eastern rug. Her attempts to announce this to him as a triumph somehow fell very flat. He began by not believing his ears, no matter how many times she repeated it. Rug? Rug? You say you've bought a rug? Nonsense. Pooh, don't be ridiculous. And when he found that the story seemed true, and that he couldn't thrust it away, his face turned a dark, unhealthy red, and he burst into roars of resentment. He shouted that he had only just arrived from hard toil in the city in search of a little damned peace. That was all that he asked, instead of which, before he had time to smoke one cigar, he was harried and tortured and victimized by a pack of low swindlers with whom his own family had leagued themselves to render him penniless. He urgently demanded to see the rug so that he could throw it straight out of the window, and the Armenian after it. He swore he'd break every bone in his body. All reports as to the rarity and value of the rug he discredited, declaring he could buy better for 50 cents a barrel on Front Street. He then marched to the Armenian's parlor with vague but violent intentions, only to find that the astute sufferer had closed his place up. The door was shut and locked, and a sign on it, Bach Nex Wick. "What's this gibberish?" Father demanded. "You said his name was Dorbabian." Poor old fawning Derbabian. His things were not good value at the time, but they at least have become so. That rug and the sofa cushion covers and great squares of silk which Mother picked up in the 80s would cost a lot more today. She had to keep them out of Father's sight, though, until he had forgotten their origin. Years afterwards, one day, when the newspapers printed some clergyman's denunciations of Turkey for its cruel Armenian massacres, I thought of how Father had longed to massacre Derbabian, and reminded him of it. Though older and calmer on some subjects, he was still resentful on this. "That's just like a parson," he said, "to sympathize with those fellows without even asking first what they have done to the Turks." Father opens my mail. There was a time in my boyhood when I felt that Father had handicapped me severely in life by naming me after him, Clarence. All literature, so far as I could see, was thronged with objectionable persons named Clarence. Percy was bad enough, but there had been some good fighters named Percy. The only Clarence in history was a duke who did something dirty at Tewkesbury, and who died a ridiculous death afterwards in a barrel of Malmsey. As for the Clarences in the fiction I read, they were horrible. In one story, for instance, there were two brothers, Clarence and Frank. Clarence was a vain, disagreeable little fellow who was proud of his curly hair and fine clothes, while Frank was a rollicking boy who was ready to play games with anybody. Clarence didn't like to play games, of course. He just minced around looking on. One day, when the mother of these boys had gone out, this story went on. Clarence, quote-unquote, tempted Frank to disobey her and fly their kite on the roof. Frank didn't want to, but Clarence kept taunting him and daring him until Frank was stung into doing it. After the two boys went up to the roof, Frank got good and dirty, running up and down and stumbling over scuttles, while Clarence sat there giving him orders and kept his natty clothes tidy. To my horror, he even spread out his handkerchief on the trap door to sit on. And to crown all, this sneak told on Frank as soon as their mother came in. This wasn't an exceptionally mean Clarence either. He was just run-of-the-mill. Some were worse. So far as I could ever learn, however, Father had never heard of these stories, and had never dreamed of there being anything objectionable in his name. Quite the contrary. And yet, as a boy, he had lived a good, rough-and-tumble boy's life. He had played and fought on the city streets, and kept a dog in Grandpa's stable, and stolen rides to Greenpoint Ferry on the high-lurching bus. In the summer he had gone to West Springfield, and had run down Shad Lane through the trees to the house where Grandpa was born, and had gone barefoot and driven the cows home just as though he had been named Tom or Bill. He had the same character as a boy, I suppose, that he had as a man, and he was too independent to care if people had thought his name fancy. He paid no attention to the prejudices of others, except to disapprove of them. He had plenty of prejudices himself, of course, but they were his own. He was humorous and confident and level-headed, and I imagine that if any boy had tried to make fun of him for being named Clarence, Father would simply have laughed and told him he didn't know what he was talking about. I asked Mother how this name had ever happened to spring up in our family. She explained that my great-great-grandfather was Benjamin Day, and my great-grandfather was Henry, and consequently my grandfather had been named Benjamin Henry. He in turn had named his eldest son Henry, and his second son Benjamin. The result was that when Father was born, there was no family name left. The privilege of choosing a name for Father had thereupon been given to Grandma, and unluckily for the Day family, she had been reading a novel the hero of which was named Clarence. I knew that Grandma, though very like Grandpa in some respects, had a dreamy side which he hadn't, a side that she usually kept to herself, in her serene, quiet way. Her romantic choice of this name probably made Grandpa smile, but he was a detached sort of man who didn't take small matters seriously, and who drew a good deal of private amusement from the happenings of everyday life. Besides, he was partly to blame in this case, because that novel was one he had published himself in his magazine. I asked Mother when she had finished why I had been named Clarence too. It hadn't been her choice, Mother said. She had suggested all sorts of names to Father, but there seemed to be something wrong with each one. When she had at last spoken of naming me after him, however, he had said at once that that was the best suggestion yet. He said it sounded just right. Father and I would have plenty of friction in any case. This identity of names made things worse. Every time I had been more of a fool than he liked, Father would try to impress on me my responsibilities as his eldest son, and above all, as the son to whom he had given his name, as he put it. A great deal was expected, it seemed to me, of a boy who was named after his father. I used to envy my brothers who didn't have anything expected of them on this score at all. I envied them still more after I was old enough to begin getting letters. I then discovered that when Father quote-unquote gave me his name, he had also, not unnaturally I had to admit, retained it himself, and when anything came for Clarence S. Day, he opened it, though it was sometimes for me. He also opened everything that came addressed to Clarence S. Day, Jr. He didn't do this intentionally, but unless the Jr. was clearly written, it looked like Esquire. And anyhow, Father was too accustomed to open all Clarence Day letters to remember about looking carefully every time for a Junior. So far as mail and express went, I had no name at all of my own. For the most part, nobody wrote to me when I was a small boy, except firms whose advertisements I had read in Youth's Companion, and to whom I had written requesting them to send me their circulars. These circulars described remarkable bargains and magicians' card outfits, stamps and coins, pocket knives, trick spiders, and imitation fried eggs, and they seemed interesting and valuable to me when I got them. The trouble was that Father usually got them and at once tore them up. I then had to write for such circulars again, and if Father got the second one too, he would sometimes explode with annoyance. He became particularly indignant one year, I remember, when he was repeatedly urged to take advantage of a special bargain sale of false whiskers. He said that he couldn't understand why these offerings kept pouring in. I knew why in this case, but at other times I was often surprised myself at the number he got, not realizing that as a result of my postcard request, my or our name had been automatically put on several large general mailing lists. During this time, I got more of my mail out of Father's wastebasket than I did from the postman. At the age of 12 or 13, I stopped writing for these childish things and turned to a new field. Father and I, whichever of us got the mail first, then began to receive not merely circulars, but personal letters beginning, "Dear Friend Day," in reply to your valued request for one of our mammoth agent's outfits, kindly forward post office order for $1.49 to cover cost of postage and packing, and we will put you in a position to earn a large income in your spare time with absolutely no labor on your part by taking subscription to the Secret Handbook of Mesmerism and our Tales of Blood series. And one spring, I remember, as the result of what I had intended to be a secret application on my part, Father was assigned the exclusive rights for Staten Island and Hoboken of selling the Jim Home Popper for popcorn. Housewives buy it at sight. After Father had stormily endured these afflictions for a while, he and I began to get letters from girls. Fortunately for our feelings, these were rare, but they were ordeals for both of us. Father had forgotten, if he ever knew, how silly young girls can sound, and I got my first lesson in how unsystematic they were. No matter how private and playful they meant their letters to be, they forgot to put Junior on the envelope every once and so often. When Father opened these letters, he read them all the way through, sometimes twice, muttering to himself over and over, "This is very peculiar. I don't understand this at all. Here's a letter to me from some person I never heard of. I can't see what it's about." By the time it had occurred to him that possibly the letter might be for me, I was red and embarrassed, and even angrier at the girl than at Father. And on days when he had read some of the phrases aloud to the family, It nearly killed me to claim it. Lots of fellows whom I knew had been named after their fathers without having such troubles. But although father couldn't have been kinder-hearted or had any better intentions, when he saw his name on a package or envelope, it never dawned on him that it might not be for him. He was too active in his habits to wait until I had a chance to get it. And as he was also single-minded and prompt to attend to unfinished business, he opened everything automatically, and then did his best to dispose of it. This went on even after I grew up, until I had a home of my own. Father was always perfectly decent about it, but he never changed. When he saw I felt sulky, he was genuinely sorry and said so. But he couldn't see why all this should annoy me, and he was surprised and amused that it did. I used to get angry once in a while when something came for me which I particularly hadn't wished him to see, and which I would find lying opened on the hall table marked, "For Junior?" when I came in, but nobody could stay angry with father. He was too utterly guiltless of having meant to offend. He often got angry himself, but it was mostly at things, not at persons, and he didn't mind a bit, as a rule, when persons got angry at him. He even declared when I got back from college, feeling dignified, and told him that I wished he'd be more careful, that he suffered from these mistakes more than I did. It wasn't his fault, he pointed out, if my stupid correspondents couldn't remember my name, and it wasn't any pleasure to him to be upset at his breakfast by finding that a damned lunatic company in Battle Creek had sent him a box of dry breadcrumbs, with a letter asserting that this rubbish would be good for his stomach. "I admit I threw it into the fireplace, Clarence, but what else could I do? If you value this preposterous concoction, my dear boy, I'm sorry. I'll buy another box for you today if you tell me where I can get it. Don't feel badly. I'll buy you a barrel, only I hope you won't eat it." In the days when Mrs. Pankhurst and her friends were chaining themselves to lampposts in London in their campaign for the vote, a letter came from Frances' hand trustfully asking, "Dear Clarence, to do something to help women's suffrage. Speak at a meeting, I think." Father got red in the face. "Speak at one of their meetings," he roared at Mother. "I'd like nothing better. You can tell Mrs. Hand that it would give me great pleasure to inform all those crackpots in petticoats exactly what I think of their antics." "Now, Claire," Mother said, "you mustn't talk that way. I like that Mrs. Hand, and anyhow this letter must be for Clarence." One time I asked Father for his opinion of a low-priced stock I had been watching. His opinion was that it was not worth a damn. I thought this over, but I still wished to buy it, so I placed a scale order with another firm instead of with Father's office, and said nothing about it. At the end of the month, this other firm sent me a statement setting forth each of my little transactions in full, and of course they forgot to put the Junior at the end of my name. When Father opened the envelope, he thought at first in his excitement that this firm had actually opened an account for him without being asked. I found him telling Mother that he'd like to wring their damned necks. "That must be for me, Father," I said when I took in what had happened. We looked at each other. "You bought this stuff?" he said incredulously. "After all I said about it?" "Yes, Father." He handed over the statement and walked out of the room. Both he and I felt offended and angry. We stayed so for several days, too, but we then made it up. Once in a while, when I got a letter that I had no time to answer, I used to address an envelope to the sender and then put anything it happened to be lying around on my desk, a circular about books, a piece of newspaper, an old laundry bill, anything at all, just to be amiable, and yet at the same time to save myself the trouble of writing. I happened to tell several people about this private habit of mine at a dinner one night, a dinner at which Alice Duer Miller and one of the two other writers were present. A little later she wrote me a criticism of Henry James and ended by saying that I needn't send her any of my old laundry bills, because she wouldn't stand it, and she forgot to put on the Junior. "In the name of God," Father said bleakly, "this is the worst yet. Here's a woman who says I'd better not read The Golden Bowl, which I have no intention whatever of doing, And she also warns me, for some unknown reason, not to send her my laundry bills. The good part of all these experiences, as I realize now, was that in the end they drew Father and me closer together. My brothers had only chance battles with him. I had a war. Neither he nor I relished its clashes, but they made us surprisingly intimate. This is the end of Part 7 of Life with Father by Clarence Day. Thank you for listening.